Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this outlook from Capitol Hill. My name is Garrick Taylor. I'm with the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We have two special guests today to give us a sense of what the heck is going on Capitol Hill. There is a lot happening, and we couldn't be more pleased to have these two guests joining us from Total Spectrum. First, allow me to introduce Erik Paulsen. Some of you who are longtime chamber participants know Congressman Paulsen. He's a former congressman representing Minnesota's 3rd congressional district. He was there from 2009 to 2019. And you might remember he served as a leading member of the Chief Tax Writing House Ways and Means Committee. That committee, as you know, is sometimes known as the Powerful Ways and Means Committee because it has jurisdiction over healthcare, the economy, trade policy, you name it. He's currently a strategic consultant for Total Spectrum, Steve Gordon and Associates. Our next panelist is Patrick Robertson. Patrick has spent nearly 2 decades in Washington. He advises executive teams, boards of directors, senior decision makers on public policy issues that pose opportunities and challenges to their organization's enterprise values. Patrick's expertise is in the fields of tax, energy, telecom, trade, and transportation. He's a partner at Confluence Government Relations, and he's a strategic consultant to Total Spectrum, Steve Gordon and Associates. Speaking of that firm, we want to thank Total Spectrum, Steve Gordon and Associates for all the work that they do on behalf of the Arizona Chamber and job creators. They're our go-to source in Washington. They provide their corporate clients the best principles of advocacy, communications, research, and politics, as well as legislative and administrative solutions at a state and federal level. They have in their bipartisan firm offices in Washington, Phoenix and Tucson, Atlanta, Denver, and even the Virgin Islands. So we're very fortunate to have them with us today. Congressman Patrick, thanks for doing this.
Great to be with you.
All right.
Thanks, Garrick.
Congressman Paulsen, let's start with you and then we'll go to Patrick. The big issue this week, and for those of you who are watching this on our recorded archive, we're recording this on March the 3rd, where the big news is another COVID relief package making its way through Congress. It's already gotten through the House. Now it's in the Senate. Congressman, this is a big price tag. We're talking $1.9 trillion. Give us a sense, what's in this big thing?
Well, it is a large bill. First of all, Garrick, thanks for having us on this morning. This is front and center in terms of a COVID relief package, economic recovery package, as the Biden administration would call it, or those advocates in Congress. And $1.9 trillion comes on the heel, actually, of a $900 and some billion bill that passed in December for COVID relief, as well as the initial bipartisan bill a year ago in March that was a little over $2 trillion. So this is on top of that. But essentially, the top components of this bill that folks would be interested in is going to have another round of stimulus checks, which include $1,400 direct payments to adults and to children, including dependents. And that will phase out at income levels of about $75,000 for individuals or $150,000 for a family. So if you've got a family of 4, it's making under $150,000, they're going to get essentially $5,600 in a direct check. Another important component that's been talked about is the unemployment insurance extension of a weekly bump of $400 per week. It initially started at $600 a year ago, went to $300 in December, and now they're talking about $400, although the Senate may even modify that provision actually as it moves forward because the bill has just passed the House. There is also an expansion of the child tax credit, moving it up from the $2,000 that we put in place as a part of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act a few years ago to $3,600 per child. And so that's an elevation in that tax credit as well. So, and you've got other dollars for local government aid. You've got funding for the premiums for COBRA payments for those that may lose health insurance as an example. But I think it's important to note that while the House bill included the minimum wage increase to $15 per hour, because of these rules in the Senate and the dynamics going on there, it looks like that will be removed and that'll have to be dealt with on a separate issue and a separate legislative track.
It's interesting that Patrick, Erik talked about what's in the bill, but I think it's an important point that he just made about what's not in the bill, at least in this Senate version. Just for our viewers, we say that we're taking this bill up in the Senate under reconciliation. What does that mean?
Sure. So I apologize to everybody. We're going to get a bit wonky for a minute, and it is not a pleasant experience. So sort of put your muck boots on and come on a walk with us. It's not like going on a hike in the desert. It's a little more like as the snow melts in Minnesota for Mr. Paulsen, what we're going to go through. But the Senate and House have something called budget reconciliation, and it's a process by which the Senate can pass legislative priorities with 50 votes. It's something that Democrats use to pass parts of the Affordable Care Act, Republicans use to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act or the Tax Reform Bill of 2017, and then Republicans failed to use to pass reforms to the Affordable Care Act. So it's not an unfamiliar process. It's something that's used when the same party controls the House, the Senate, and the White House. And what happens is both chambers of Congress pass a budget bill with something called reconciliation targets. And let me just use the small business title of this bill as an example. Both houses passed a budget with $50 billion in targets for small business spending in late January, early February. And then those targets went to the Small Business Committee in the House, who wrote a bill that spent $50 billion, $25 billion in grants to restaurants, and $25 billion in a few other items. That bill then went to the House Budget Committee, which took that $50 billion along with instructions from all the other committees in the House and smashed those 13 bills together into one. And that bill met the $1.9 trillion threshold. And then that bill passed the House last week. So $1.9 trillion in new spending under budget reconciliation. Up until now, up until this point in the process, that's something that the House could have done on its own. The House has a majority rule. They need 218 of 435 votes to pass things. So up until that point, they could have done it on its own. Now the bill goes to the Senate, where usually items are subject to a 60-vote filibuster. But under the budget reconciliation process, they're fast-tracked. You only need 51 votes or 50 votes plus the tie-breaking vote of the vice president to pass something. So now we're in the Senate, and you would think, okay, they just take the House bill, $1.9 trillion, pass it, and you're done. I grew up in West Virginia, although my wife and her family all grew up in Tucson, so it's a place that I like to go often. But we had a senator in West Virginia called Robert C. Byrd, and on the campaign trail, he would say there are three things you can always count on: the God Almighty himself, Carter's cod liver oil pills. He actually said four things: Sears, Roebuck and Company, and Senator Robert C. Byrd, right? And that was his stump speech. But he put in a provision called the Byrd Rule, B-Y-R-D, named after himself, like almost everything in West Virginia is named after him. And the Byrd Rule says that under the budget reconciliation process, you can't spend money outside the 10-year budget window, and you can't have policy that's only incidental to federal spending. And so the bill goes through a process with the Senate parliamentarian, which is now belovedly called the Byrd bath. And anything that is not Byrd Rule compliant becomes something called a Byrd dropping. And so the $15 an hour federal minimum wage is now officially a Byrd dropping because the Senate parliamentarian ruled it was not allowed under the Byrd rules of the budget reconciliation process. The parliamentarian is still going through that process for other titles of the bill. But what you see is something like raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour and eliminating the tip credit is something that the parliamentarian has ruled is only incidental to federal spending. It would have, we've shown, we being Washington, the CBO, has shown it would have an effect on the budget, but that effect is merely incidental to the actual policy. And another great example of a Byrd dropping is during the tax reform process of 2017. The title, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, was ruled that it wasn't relevant to the bill, so it was dropped. So it was just called Bill to Amend the Tax Act of 1986. So you get some of those things. Parliamentarians still ruling on some of these things. There are open questions out there, but that's where we are in the process, and that's what reconciliation is. I apologize again for being so wonky, but it takes a couple minutes to get to what we're actually dealing with.
No, I appreciate the explanation. And for those of you who are watching live, you should feel free to use the chat window, and we'll post some questions to our panelists. A Congressman Paulsen, you were on the Hill for a decade. For those of us outside the Beltway, we see a number like 1.9 trillion. That is a huge number. Uh, uh, is it a big number to members of Congress? Or is this just the cost of doing business? And I ask that because there are certain groups, including the U.S. Chamber, that have said this bill is just too big. The economy's recovering. This is too much, and the timing's not right. Though to Patrick's point about certain industries like the restaurant industry, they are saying throw the kitchen sink at this thing because our industry is really struggling. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that, but also what a more centrist member of Congress or members of the Senate, including Kirsten Sinema, Patrick referenced Joe Manchin, maybe talk about the role they're playing in this debate.
Well, I think one thing to point out is that, we're a year into the pandemic now, and so we know a lot more now than we did then. And initially, we realized with the shutdowns that were happening that a lot of stimulus was going to have to be targeted and pumped into the economy. The Federal Reserve spoke of that, and it was necessary to kind of keep things flowing, right, and keep our economy strong. We are seeing a resurgence in economic recovery already without passing the 1.9 trillion. So you're seeing now sort of a process play out in Washington where there are some that are a little more skeptical of whether we need to spend all of these dollars on these programs. In fact, that's why a lot of Republicans have dug in and have opposed the reconciliation process because it becomes so partisan, particularly in the House, where now it's become more of a wish list for some of the progressives that want to have their opportunity to pass some of these provisions in a bill they know is going to get signed into law by the president. And so there is some more skepticism, but let's be honest, both Republicans and Democrats in Washington for a long period of time have talked about the concerns of the federal debt, but they've done little to alleviate the situation of our rising national debt overall. And so, as this moves forward, it's going to be highlighted, and eventually it's going to be, it's come home to roost. But it's probably being played out where there are some critics now, of course, they're saying, look, let's focus what's important to COVID for what we know now. We didn't know a year ago where health resources should go, for instance, maybe helping schools open up and get those open. But some of these other provisions, a subway or a tunnel that's in, Silicon Valley, maybe that should wait for the infrastructure bill that's coming down the road next.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we're going to talk about infrastructure in a second, but Patrick, can you just give our viewers a sense of where we are in the process? We're recording this today on Wednesday, March the 3rd. Could we have a vote as soon as this week and then have a final bill adopted back in the House early next?
Yeah, so let me just put a little twist on what Erik said. He's absolutely right. I think what you'll find is there are people in Washington who are concerned about the federal debt when they're not in charge, and not as concerned about the federal debt when they are, which is human nature. And that happens to be Republicans now, but it's also true of Democrats. So I don't want to paint with a red or a blue brush on that point, right? When you don't like something, you talk about the federal debt. When you want to do something, you ignore it. And liberal economists say that money is so cheap right now, you ought to do as much as you can, while conservative economists say that a debt this big is gonna saddle the economy for decades to come. So it's a debate that everyone's having. It's not going to change, and it's not going to be resolved in the next 2 weeks. This bill's going to pass the Senate this week, one way or another. It may change a little bit. I think Erik mentioned that they're talking about changing expanded UI to $400 from $400 a month to $300 and stretching it out longer if it's needed. There are going to be tweaks like that may happen in the Senate, but the Senate's going to pass this bill this week. They're talking about a vote-a-rama as soon as today or tomorrow. Vote-a-rama is a process by which you run out of time to debate, and then you just vote on as many amendments as people want to vote on until you finish the bill. The Senate absolutely expects to finish that bill this week. It'll go back to the House then, which will have to pass it again, because obviously the House passed the bill with $15 an hour minimum wage in it and tip credit, and the Senate isn't going to, so we'll have to go back to the House. But they'll pass it in a very expedited process, no amendments and very little debate, and then it'll be on the president's desk. The promise was that it would be on the president's desk before March 14th, which is when expanded UI benefits expire. It looks like it's going to be there 4 or 5 days early, which in Washington is a tremendously amazing accomplishment. In all of your businesses, being 4 or 5 days early for a multi-trillion-dollar deadline doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but here it is.
Yeah. For those of you just joining us, we're talking with Erik Paulsen and Patrick Robertson, about what's going on Capitol Hill. Congressman Paulsen, you referenced infrastructure. Should we assume that that's the next big thing on the agenda? Excuse us if we approach this with some skepticism, because we were told in the previous administration that an infrastructure bill was right around the corner, and then it wasn't. So what do you think? Is that next on tap?
I think it is next on tap. I know Patrick can run through a line item or a laundry list of items that are potentially going to be included. I'll just let you know that from my perspective, they're going to, in the House, work off of the base bill of last year's infrastructure bill that funded roads and bridges, for instance, but they will add to that a number of other provisions that focus on some broadband expansion, green energy initiatives, et cetera, which will add to a large price tag again. And that also will likely be a reconciliation process to move it forward quickly and efficiently under Democrat control. I think the initial thinking was that there would be a tax package that would provide some resources for bringing in more revenues to the federal government sometime in September. But now it looks like the infrastructure package, which will start moving shortly this spring and in early summer, is going to be tied together with the tax package. And I think some of the momentum around some of the tax provisions to watch for include a corporate tax rate increase up to 28%, for instance, increases in the estate tax, capital gains, no stepped up basis at death, for instance. Certainly a focus on international taxes. There's a lot of effort that will be going on there, as well as energy taxes and an increase in marginal rates. I think it's also safe to assume that Democrats who want to advocate for these increases are not going to be able to do all of them. A lot of it depends on where some of our senators are going to be. As you mentioned, Senator Sinema, for instance, or Senator Manchin, that will potentially be a swing vote in keeping not only the filibuster provision alive, but also swinging the vote where some of these bills might be able to pass for some of the revenue provisions for infrastructure.
Congressman, it's worth watching because all the progress that was made in the tax reforms of 2017 in the TCJA, as you know, globally from the US corporate tax rate, we stuck out like a sore thumb. We really ratcheted that back under that reform bill of 2017. Did I hear you right that there is going to be a play to increase that corporate rate?
There will be, and all the targeting efforts that I was certainly involved in and advocating for was centered around growth, knowing that we wanted to get the United States down to at least the average level. We don't need to be the lowest in the world, but we just need to be at average, and we can compete and win on everything else. Mm-hmm. But if we go to 28%, which is what the Biden administration is advocating for, that would move us to the highest of all OECD countries in the world. And so we would be uncompetitive again. And so it's something certainly policymakers should be paying attention to in terms of keeping jobs here at home.
It's definitely a concern. Patrick, you heard Erik talk about what might be in an infrastructure bill. Patrick, when we talk infrastructure, we're not just talking about asphalt anymore, are we?
No, we're not. Sorry, I was muted. We're talking about, infrastructure has a huge, wide, broad definition now. Infrastructure is roads, bridges, airports, ports, water, infrastructure. All of those things are going to be included in this bill. But there's still a hang up on some of those things. Mm-hmm. So for instance, the Highway Trust Fund doesn't currently fund itself with the gas tax. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of the biggest bogey in this process. The Highway Trust Fund used to charge a federal gas tax on all gasoline, and it would fund the road system. And there was an agreement that the needs of the road system about matched the income from the federal gas tax. It was simple. Now we have Teslas and Priuses and, people using different amounts of gasoline. Gasoline isn't the only marker for how much you're using our roads. We have LNG and CNG buses and trucks out there. Soon we're going to have autonomous vehicles on some roads. So the gas tax isn't the right answer anymore. There's a new idea out there called a vehicle miles traveled fee, which some view as a fee, some view as a tax. It doesn't matter what you call it. You get charged for how far you drive, right? If you live in Scottsdale and you have to drive to downtown Phoenix for work every day, and you do so in a car that runs on gasoline, then either the gas tax or the VMT is going to treat you about the same, right? However, if you live in Casa Grande or somewhere further down the road and you're driving to Phoenix in a Prius and you're able to use HOV lanes or whatever the rules are, you start to get mixed in there and you don't pay the same amount. The other problem is if you live in, anywhere north of 30 miles north of Minneapolis, you're in a rural area and you got to drive farther for work. And the VMT and a gas tax don't treat you the same because, sitting in traffic burns gas, driving burns gas. There's a lot of issues out there. And so they can't decide how to pay for it, right? And so in order to get an infrastructure package done, they're going to make it bigger. They're going to include green energy provisions. Which is good for Arizona. They're going to include development tax incentives. They're going to include broadband expansion, some of which is going to be in this program now. They're going to include workforce investment. Infrastructure is becoming both stimulus and investment in the economy, more so than it is laying a half a mile of pavement. Yeah. The one thing I want to say about Erik's point about paying for it, he said something that I want to highlight, which is of all those ideas, Democrats won't be able to do them all. He's right. There's a consensus on the Democratic side of the aisle that 21% was too low, that the original debate about corporate tax rates had it between 25 and 28. And the House especially pushed to 21 and it stayed there in the Senate. And so there is some room because that's what they heard from some of the corporate groups before tax reform. At the same time, President Biden has said he will absolutely not raise taxes while the pandemic's going on, right? Because he is really worried about the economic recovery. And the way this process is playing out, it looks like an infrastructure bill is going to happen while the pandemic's still going on. So somebody's going to have to make a choice at that point, right? Do you look at things just like the carried interest loophole, which is a thing for investors and real estate people, and close that, which doesn't raise you nearly enough money to put a dent in this package? Or do you go to some of the bigger items? And the last thing I want to say, I know I've taken up a lot of time, but the one thing I want to mention about this infrastructure package and the debate over tax increases, I'm so sorry, I just forgot it. I will come back with it, but let's move on. I apologize.
That's all right. For everyone who just tuned in, we're with Erik Paulsen and Patrick Robertson talking about what's going on in Capitol Hill. All right, let's do a little speed round here because believe it or not, 30 minutes flies by. Erik Paulsen, we in the last administration, we saw two things happen on trade. We saw the adoption of USMCA to modernize the legacy NAFTA, but we also saw some real, what that's called hostility on the trade front, even slapping tariffs on our friends in Canada and Mexico and our allies around the world. What do you think the Biden administration's posture on trade is going to be?
Well, real quick, I'll just mention this, is that the nominee for the USTR, the United States Trade Representative, is Catherine Tai, and she is a former Ways and Means staffer who was there when I was on the committee, and she has support from Republicans and Democrats. In fact, both the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and the ranking member, Richie Neal and Kevin Brady, introduced her at her confirmation hearing in the Senate, which says something about bipartisan priorities focused around trade, and our policies are successful when there is an executive branch working with Congress. So that's a good sign. I would say what we can expect is this. There's going to certainly be the focus, number one, on COVID first, a U.S. jobs focus as a part of that, and a top priority also from the new trade agenda that the Biden administration have will be on climate change. We will see that as an emphasis for new negotiations on how that can be tied in. And also it's going to be there will be a focus on how to anchor more critical supply chains in the United States for domestic sourcing. We saw the need for that in the pandemic. Now, that has to be watched very carefully, but that's something that we'll be focused on. And finally, I'll mention with China, because you mentioned the tariff issue, which was used as a blunt instrument, not only versus China, but our allies as well. I would expect that the decoupling with China is going to be a bipartisan continuance. We've seen that accelerate. It used to be in Congress, what do we do to get along with China? But on Capitol Hill, policymakers are increasingly looking, what do we do to decouple? And so I expect that's going to continue with the Biden administration, although the Biden administration is likely to tie in some of our European allies or looking at what happened with TPP, for instance, with some of our Asian allies and how to counter China. More aggressive posturing in that area of the world.
Let's talk a little bit about how things are going, how the different parties are operating on the Hill. And Patrick, I'll start with you, then I want to hear from Congressman Paulsen. The headlines say, Patrick, that earmarks are back. They're calling them something else. But so first of all, are earmarks back? And secondly, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And keep in mind, you're talking to the Arizona Chamber, where we have a long legacy of reformers from John McCain and Jeff Flake on this front. So what do you think, Patrick? What does the future hold for earmarks?
So this actually reminds me of the thing I wanted to say earlier. So I will say that Erik said that infrastructure is likely to move in reconciliation, and I agree with that. But Democrats moving the very first bill this year under reconciliation protections is going to make it harder to work with Republicans. It's also going to make it harder to work with Democrats. There are some Senate Democrats who are unhappy with the process right now. So at least at the beginning of this infrastructure push, Democrats are going to go through the regular order, go back to committees, try to be bipartisan. And the onus is on both sides to be bipartisan, right? And so one of the ways they're going to try to do that is through earmarks, right? They're called something else. It used to be member-directed spending. Now it's like local project initiatives or something. I don't quite remember the name, but they're back, and I think they're fairly valuable. Unlike the John McCains and the Jeff Flakes of the world, I came from Robert C. Byrd world, where earmarks were really, really valuable to a state that didn't get very much from the federal government for a long time. So, ideally, everybody comes to the table and sort of shapes the big policy into something that looks like something both sides could take. And then everybody also gets something they can go home and brag about. And so people are happy. There are tons of folks in town who still don't like earmarks. But the one thing that's always struck me is what we did was we took the power to decide what happens on a local level away from Paul Gosar or from Ann Kirkpatrick or whoever, and we gave it to someone in Washington who isn't hearing from the local community very often. And so I do think that regardless of whether they come back, that's one of the values where every community gets a say in how money's spent.
Congressman, earmarks, they're either the lubricant to keep government moving or they lead to bridges to nowhere. What's your take on this?
Well, I think what's going to be key is as this new earmark process works its way through is to make sure that one, they're transparent, right, early in the process, and that I think there are some limitations on what members can offer, for instance. They're going to be posted online. And so I think Patrick's right. There'll be a lot of members on both sides that are interested in this process for accountability perspective, as opposed to giving control to the executive branch. But the transparency component is going to be critical or essential to make sure it passes public scrutiny.
Yeah. Patrick and Erik, as we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about the Arizona delegation. We have a statewide U.S. Senate race in Arizona pretty much every cycle now. That's just because of the way things have worked out on the electoral calendar. Senator Kelly is going to be up in 2022 if he's going to seek his own 6-year term. Patrick, what should put your campaign manager hat on? What should the senator be thinking about in terms of how he approaches his work on the Hill this year?
Sure. I think it's March 3rd, right? So presumably by now he's figured out where the bathrooms are and how to get to the Capitol and the subway, and those are really important things for a first-time senator, and that's what you spend part of the first part of your term doing, is staffing up and making sure you're ready to go. Now, I think as he turns into serious legislating, I believe that the best United States senators do two things really well. The first is constituent services, right? So when someone from Arizona calls, you answer. And if someone from Arizona calls and Erik or I call, answer the person from Arizona first, right? Help them with their passport, help them with their IRS issue, help them with whatever they have. So constituent services one, but then the second thing that's really important is listening. And it appears to me from all the folks I talked to in Arizona that Senator Sinema does a pretty good job of listening and of representing the interests of Arizona and Washington at this point. She hasn't been here very long, but people seem to trust her and believe that she's an honest broker. And I think Senator Kelly could learn a lot from that, and sort of, advocating for Arizona in the Senate as opposed to advocating for Democrats or NASA or whatever the pet issue you want to believe Mark Kelly has. Make it about Arizona before it's about those other things.
Erik Paulsen, you've had to run tough competitive races yourself. Any advice for Senator Kelly?
Well, one thing I will say that I think Senator Kelly is doing, and we just had an interview with him a couple of weeks ago, for instance, but he did mention that he's been spending time getting to know his colleagues on both sides. And so if you want to be an effective legislator, you need to build relationships. And he's doing that with Republicans, which is really, I think, what the country's looking for, and certainly those in Arizona are looking for to make progress on the legislative front. And let's face it, there's narrow majorities in the House and in the Senate, and legislators want to get things done. And they're able to get things done if they don't focus so much on maybe what their base wants, but what the broader population wants. And that means compromising, building consensus, being a good listener, and then moving the ball forward. And so he's got some real good opportunities, as well as hopefully some progress along the front across the board in Congress. We'll have to wait and see.
Right. Gentlemen, 30 minutes flew by. Erik Paulsen, Patrick Robertson, thanks for joining us. And our thanks to Total Spectrum, Steve Gordon Associates. Many of you watching this webinar subscribe to This Week in Washington, a publication produced by our friends at Total Spectrum. You're also subscribers to Chamber Business News, where we feature a weekly wrap up with content from our friends at Total Spectrum. So Erik Paulsen, Patrick Robertson, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Garrick.
Thanks.